Welcome to today's webinar, the top 5 missing middle housing implementation mistakes and how to avoid them, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning in association with the Smart Growth Network. My name is Michael Bayer. I'm the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network, supported by the U.S. EPA's Office of Community Revitalization and managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website at smartgrowth.org that provides information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. The website provides information about events, funding opportunities, awards, and resources to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is the virtual home of the Smart Growth Network, a nationally recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Maryland Department of Planning on smart growth and planning topics available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. We are recording this webinar and will be posting it on our website under the Webinar Archives tab. We encourage you to visit the website and to subscribe to our e-newsletter to learn about our upcoming webinars. You can also find out about planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. The views expressed by the speaker in this webinar are those of the speaker and not necessarily of the Maryland Department of Planning or the state of Maryland. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association and 1.5 CNUA CEU self-reported credits from the Congress for the New Urbanism. To log your AICP credits, visit the American Planning Association's website at planning.org, log into your account, and search for the name of today's event, which is the top 5 missing middle housing implementation mistakes and how to avoid them. You can also search for event number 921-8768. Also for today, AIA members may self-report this webinar for AIA LU HSW credits using the certificate auto-generated for you by GoToWebinar. As we mentioned at the end of all of our webinars, all attendees will receive an email that will contain a link to a personalized certificate of participation. Please look for this follow-up email to claim your certificate, and please refer any specific questions about reporting the credits to AIA. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge our partner, Island Press, and their partnerships manager, Jen Hawes. Founded in 1984, Island Press's mission is to provide the best ideas and information to those seeking to understand and protect the environment and to create solutions to its complex problems. So today we welcome back Dan Parolek. Dan Parolek is an architect, urban designer, and the founding principal of Opticos Design, a national company of thought leaders in urban placemaking, innovative housing design, and policy and zoning reform. Under Dan's leadership, Opticos has received the American Planning Association's Burnham Prize, the Congress for the New Urbanism's Charter Award Grand Prize, and Golden Nugget Awards. Dan coined the term missing middle housing and is a champion of the missing middle housing movement. Dan also co-authored the book Form-Based Codes and co-founded the Form-Based Code Institute. Dan holds a Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Notre Dame and a Master of Urban Design from the University of California at Berkeley. Following his presentation, Dan will answer as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question anytime by using the questions tool in the control panel located on the right side of your screen. So to get started, we're going to launch our usual poll to find out where everybody is visiting from today. So you can see the options here: West, Midwest, South, Mid-Atlantic, Northeast, or International. And we always have a few folks from outside the US with us today, so it'll be interesting to see who is here and where you're from. So we'll give you all a couple seconds to respond. If you're having any trouble with the poll, you may need to exit from full screen mode, and that will give you an opportunity to respond. We'll leave this open for a few more seconds to give everybody a chance to respond to it, and then we'll turn it over to Dan. And thanks to everybody who is responding. We can see the votes coming in. Okay, the response today: 28% Mid-Atlantic Northeast, 25% from the West, 22% from the South, 18% from the Midwest, and 6% international. So with that, we're going to go and turn it over to Dan. Welcome, Dan.
Hey, good afternoon and good morning to everybody. Get this queued up. Well, thanks to the Smart Growth Network for hosting me here again today to talk about and present about the top 5 mistakes to avoid when implementing missing middle housing. I always like to start my missing middle presentations with a photo of one of my favorite missing middle types. And this is a really excellent example of a recently built cottage court that was designed by our colleagues at Union Studio. It's also a case study in my book that delivers really high quality living units that are 1,000 square feet and down to 850 square feet. And I really love this cottage court example because it delivers great housing choices for a lot of different types of households, ranging from downsizing baby boomers, single person households, which now make up a third of our households. It delivers attainability for first time home buyers and really just delivers a really great housing choice for any household that wants to live a little bit more compactly in exchange for living in a walkable urban environment. Now, it should be really straightforward and simple to get entitlement and to build these cottage court types and other missing middle types, but the sad reality is that it's just not. I would say 90% or even a little bit more of the cities and counties across the country, the development standards and in particular the zoning are in place for delivering this really great cottage court type as well as the broader range of missing middle housing types. And a part of that is that our zoning is driven by a suburban default. And this really, part of my missing middle message is this really has to change, and we need to figure out ways, all of us here on this webinar, to deliver these housing choices that are in demand, but more importantly, that are needed to address this housing affordability crisis that's really touched every corner of the country now and is only expanding. I first created the missing middle housing diagram, the first version of it, for a Smart Growth Network publication in 2013. But this full range of missing middle housing types and enabling them, and specifically within walkable communities, has been inherent in our practice at Opticos for actually over 20 years now. In terms of planning and zoning, right, that application really started at a neighborhood scale, thinking about corridor revitalization, downtown plans, and transitions in form-based coding and other zoning reform applications to deliver that. But it has grown over the last handful of years to the enabling and application of missing middle housing at a citywide and countywide scale within comprehensive plans, like the 2 plans, the one for Kauai County and the one for Memphis, that we played a role in to enable missing middle housing. And in terms of architecture and master planning, we've been working with innovative developers as well for 20 years to deliver missing middle. And this is just one example of a photo of the missing middle neighborhood that we master planned and did the architecture for in Papillion, Nebraska, which is the Omaha Metro. And I think it's, the lessons learned that we've learned over the course of the past 20 years in being able to bridge the conversation between public and private sectors has been really invaluable to us and to our clientele as well. And a lot has happened in the past few years. I'm sure many of you are aware of these things, but I just wanted to reinforce the progress that's being made and the visibility that missing middle is getting, just so that you can, in your communities, you can share the message that this isn't just something new or only happening in a few places. And it really sort of has spread to this application at the statewide scale with starting with Oregon's groundbreaking legislation in the HB 2001 bill, which was passed in 2019, that broadly enabled up to triplexes and fourplexes in cities across the state. And depending on size, it's either a triplex or fourplex. And then in 2020, my home state of Nebraska followed suit and actually passed a Missing Middle Housing Act, which takes similar actions to deliver broader housing choices to address the affordability issues that they're starting to see across the state as well. And I'm sure we've all seen this, and it's probably impacting all the communities we're living and working in, but the affordability issues have only gotten worse in the past year and a half, 2 years. And I think the strange implications of COVID have only put the fuel on the fires in many places. But right, large percentage of our households are housing cost burdened, which means they're spending more than 30% of their incomes on just housing. And I just saw a new statistic that 50% of households that are renting are housing cost burdened. So it only continues to grow and get worse. So we need to get creative, and we need to think of a number of different tools from a planning, zoning, policy perspective to address this really dire need for choices, and choices at more attainable and affordable price points. And, I don't think we can have this conversation about housing and zoning reform without just acknowledging first and foremost that racial inequities, our zoning and housing policies have played a major role in the inequities that we see in Black and brown households and the racial wealth gap we see. And so we need to be thinking about that and addressing that as well. I just want to recommend, I'm sure many of you have read this, Richard Rothstein's Color of Law, which just really clearly and impactfully defines and tells the story of these issues across the country. So the other thing we're seeing is that small and medium-sized towns have had rapidly rising housing costs. It isn't just a big city or large metro issue anymore. Over the course of the last couple of years, a lot of our work on what we call the missing middle scan and a deep dive, which identifies where municipalities should be prioritizing missing middle and identifying specific barriers in policy planning and zoning. A lot of that has happened in smaller towns. A place like Boise, Idaho was an affordable or an attainable market 2 or 3 years ago, but now it is no longer affordable. So the impacts are spilling out into smaller places like Idaho Falls or Caldwell that would not have expected to have these sorts of housing pressures in the recent past even, and this is happening across the country in more rural regions. I just did a presentation for Build Maine on missing middle housing, and know that they're having and addressing similar issues up in the Northeast as well. And it's really become, I would say, in a majority of markets, if not all markets, for builders to deliver single-family homes at attainable price points. And some of the creative work that we've been doing with developers is we're taking their previously entitled new urbanist walkable communities and re-entitling areas that were entitled only for single-family homes, and changing that to enable and allow a broad range of missing middle housing types. And this is just one example of a project called Flynn Farm in Missoula, Montana, where we just went through that exercise of enabling a broader range of missing middle in the entitlements in those particular areas. And then, right, even townhouses have become tough to deliver in most markets. And this is just an example. It's a story of a builder, Homes approaching us about 3.5, 4 years ago. They were building townhouses in the Salt Lake City market, but they couldn't build them at a price point that was attainable to entry-level buyers. And so they're wondering if some missing middle design solutions and housing types could help them deliver that attainability. So we delivered this Muse housing type, which enabled them to sell an entry-level house at a high quality at a price point that was about $25,000 less than their tucked under townhouse. Now, The sad reality is with the growing costs over the course of the last couple of years, these have gone up nearly $40,000 per unit. So it's just emphasizing this real need to get creative about this. The one really good thing is that the missing middle has become part of the housing lexicon for building and developers, both in terms of for sale and for rent. This really great report published by ULI's Terwilliger Center a few years ago in partnership with RCLCO identifies missing middle housing as one of 3 strategies to enable developers to deliver attainable housing choices. So it's really great to see that sort of application and visibility and utilization as well. It's also that the topic of missing middle housing has also gained really broad support from organizations like ARP has become one of the biggest proponents of missing middle housing as part of their Livable Communities initiative. We've actually been doing consulting for ARP now for the last 3+ years, educating their constituency with presentations, white papers, and walking tours. And so it's really great to engage that large, broad audience about this conversation. And then community groups have been personalizing the missing middle to enable them to gain support for these broader housing choices and attainability within their communities. And this was a great adaptation from a group called Neighbors for More Neighbors that I really enjoyed, and just shows the creativity that's being used and needs to be used to engage and to build support for these housing choices. And then the last thing is I reached a real milestone last year with the publication of my book. I was super excited to see that Planetizen voted it as one of their top 10 planning books of 2020. Really excited about that, and I just encourage you to pick up a copy. It's a very graphic document that presents in-depth, a broad range of topics related to missing middle housing. And so before I jump into the 5 mistakes, I do want to take about just a couple of minutes to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of how we define missing middle housing. I'm sure most of you on this call are at a 200 or higher level with missing middle understanding, but this is just really, really important to share this foundation that missing middle housing or house scale buildings with multiple units in walkable neighborhoods. And if you're going to take one concept away today is this concept of, and even just the terminology of using house scale. So even though these missing middle buildings have more units, have multiple units in them, they never get beyond house scale. And it's just a really important concept like this. Building on the right here, you would walk by it, you could bike by it and drive by it and not even consider that it's not a medium-sized single-family home, but the reality is it's actually a triplex, and that's this type of delivering a high-quality, predictable form with multiple units is an important part of missing middle. And why do we call it missing? Some of the research we did while I was writing the book, this information data from the American Housing Survey shows that there was a steady decline in the delivery of missing middle housing starting in the late 70s, and an even bigger drop after the recession in the 2008-2009 period. And so there's less than 5% of all housing annually delivered was missing middle housing, and so there's just a really dire need to address this and figure out how to deliver more. I could talk for hours about the many barriers. This is a topic that I wrote an entire chapter on for my book. Just encourage you to take a look at that and think about them. But in terms of planning and zoning, which is the first barrier that I encourage cities to remove, just keep in mind that this camera in the photo here was built in the same, approximately the same year that zoning was starting to be implemented. And that zoning operating system hasn't been changed much since that first application period. So there's just a lot of modernization and new thinking that we need to apply to our zoning to really enable walkable urbanism as well as these missing middle housing types. And so why did I shift my focus, and why do I feel it's important to highlight the mistakes that we see municipalities and their consultants making across the country? I think that Back in the 1970s, a lot of cities upzoned their downtown adjacent neighborhoods, and it delivered a lot of really bad results that are still eyesores to communities. And it's a large part of what created the pushback, I believe, to the concept of non-single family housing choices in communities. And it's the type of housing that I think a lot of community members envision when we talk about, if you use the terms like density or multifamily apartments. And that's why I encourage us to shift away from those terms and to talk more generally about housing types and housing choices. And with development pressures even higher now, you could imagine that the results, if it's not carefully and thoughtfully regulated, will be even worse than what we saw in the 1970s. So just as I was assessing the top 5 mistakes, I was thinking about the primary objectives of missing middle, the top 3, which are the delivery of a thoughtful form and scale that has a minimal visual impact to a community, the delivery of attainable price points, and financial feasibility, because it doesn't make any sense to make these changes if we're not sure that it's financially feasible and there's enough incentive for a developer to come in and actually build the housing that's not needed. So jumping now into the top 5 mistakes to avoid. The first mistake is allowing the types that do not deliver attainability and what I call our bad neighbors. And these are the types that where we see that the market will deliver these if they're allowed. And so we encourage cities to be really thoughtful about what they're enabling and to make sure that they're enabling the right things. And the first result that we encourage cities not to allow are what we call slot homes, or that are called slot homes more broadly. And what this is in this diagram you see, it's townhouses that are perpendicular to the street, that are basically an extruded volume that goes from the front setback to the rear setback. And they're not good for 2 reasons. First of all, we've seen that they do not deliver attainable price points, and it's partly because they're larger units. And secondarily, they're just bad form and scale. And I think that diagram doesn't really kind of tell that full story, but this image does. Just right, it's a type that doesn't have high quality spaces on site for its residents. It doesn't really engage the street in a good way. It's extruding the volume from the front to the rear of the lot. So you can imagine some sort of privacy issues with sort of the units at the rear of the lots. And it's just not good urban form. And cities across the country have struggled with this. Denver actually had a really heated battle about this starting a number of years ago, and they ultimately went through a planning process to change the zoning to not enabling them. And we're seeing similar stories unfolding in places like Cleveland, and we've seen a lot of these built in Houston as well. So the second thing of making sure you're not allowing is multiple full-size single-family detached units on a lot. And for similar reasons, these are not delivering attainability, and they're just not a good sort of form and scale. And so this is just an example, and this is a really high market that it's an example of, but you could just do the sort of a comparison with a lower value market as well. But where we've seen that a single house will be bought, and in this example, it was it was bought at $1.2 million, tore down, and the developer built 4 homes that they sold each for $1.5 million. Even if that was buying that original house for $500 or $400, it's just saying that it's going to deliver more housing, but it's going to deliver housing that's not really delivering attainability in terms of what we've seen happening in markets across the country. So you just have to be really thoughtful about where you allow these types, or if you allow these types. And it's just a very different result in a form than a cottage court, which is multiple homes on a lot, but they're smaller scale. They deliver the attainability, and they're more thoughtful about the open spaces and the community spaces that are on those sites. The second mistake is treating the number of units per lot the same as housing types. And it's a little bit hard for a lot of people to understand this, but the missing middle housing types, it's really important to understand and to be able to communicate about each of these types, because each of these types has an intended form and scale in addition to having an implied number of units. So in terms of talking about these missing middle housing types, it's not just simply about, hey, we want to allow 3, 4, or 5 plus lots, a number of units on a lot, but rather, if we're delivering a number of units on a lot, we want them to have a specific form and scale that that reinforces a good and a thoughtful approach to housing type design as well as neighborhood design. And so the first thing we need to do is clearly define a fourplex. And when we were writing the book, we refined the names of these a little bit. And so we started calling this a fourplex stacked. And this is one of my favorite missing middle types. It can be found in pretty much every neighborhood built prior to the 1940s, but what it is 2 units on the ground floor side by side with the same 2 units up above mirrored. And we have documented the characteristics of this housing type as well as all of the other missing middle housing types. We first made this available at missingmiddlehousing.com, and now this information and additional information is available in my book. But this data that we've documented through years of research and analysis is available for alley-loaded as well as front-loaded examples of each of the types. And I just encourage you to use these as reference points as you're thinking about what types to allow, how do they fit on lots that are typical in your community, and how that can inform the zoning to allow a thoughtful form and scale. And so just a few examples of 4 units on a lot, but not a fourplex type, to reinforce this idea of housing type versus number of units. So a townhouse is a good missing middle type, but we often see that 4 townhouses sort of attached are called a fourplex. And just for clarity's sake, we encourage that this just be called a 4-unit townhouse run, or just call it a townhouse. But just wanting to differentiate, because the built result is different and has different implications than the built result of that stacked fourplex that I showed you earlier. And then here is an example of 4 single-family homes on a lot. And once again, we just encourage you not to call this a fourplex. It's, in our minds, it's not a fourplex. It is 4 units. Maybe it's called a house cluster. Maybe it's not called a type at all. It's not an end result that we encourage or like to promote for the reasons I mentioned above, in terms of not delivering attainability and not really being a good form and scale. And you can see over the course of a number of years that single example, is one thing, but if you think about the evolution of a typical block with those types being applied over the course of 10, 15, 20 years, it just doesn't really create a very desirable outcome as a final result. So that's why we like to not encourage it. And just want cities, want counties, as they're going through this process, to be thoughtful about if they want to allow those examples or those built results, and if so, where specifically. And then, I wanted to give an example of clearly defining a duplex, just as another example of not just being 2 units per lot, but just implying a specific form and scale. But so we've actually broken down the duplex type into subtypes, where there's a side-by-side type, and this example is just a single-story version that you may actually want to create a specific classification for. The stacked version in the middle, which has 1 unit on the ground floor and another unit above, which is a really great type for cities and neighborhoods that have narrower lots, existing lots, and just a different version, a variation of a stacked duplex on the far right, just showing that there is some variation that does happen often locally or regionally within each of those housing types. And so what these all have in common is this house scale that I mentioned before, and they do preserve a rear yard space, which is a really good part of a good urban form of a walkable neighborhood. So, this is a housing type. We find these examples all the time of this really great one-story side-by-side duplex. This was a zoning process we were leading in Austin, where community members really liked this type and how it delivered attainability. But if it's not regulated thoughtfully, what you're going to get is this result, which is also in Austin, where there were a zone that allowed 2 units per lot. I think it actually called it a duplex, but instead of getting that great side-by-side duplex with smaller attainable units, they were getting built results that were just 2 full-size single-family houses, one in the front and one in the back. And so I'm not saying that this is necessarily a result that you should say no to everywhere. I'm just saying that you need to be thoughtful about how you allow a duplex, what types of duplexes allow, and where you might want to allow that, thinking about the implications of those end results. So I just want to mention as a message that the building type is not an allowed use, but rather it's a desired form. And that's a shift that needs to really happen mentally in a lot of sort of planning efforts and within a lot of planners. This is just an example of a new zoning district we created in Iowa City, Iowa, where it shows in the middle here, you can see that table number 3 specifically identifies which of the missing middle housing types are allowed in that zoning district and what the maximum building sizes are as well. And so the approaches to missing middle housing that we use and that we see are most effective are actually replacing or making targeted refinements to the base zoning, as opposed to adding guidelines or even overlays on top of zoning, which often make it more complex and really hard, just to add a little bit more risk and lack of clarity to the delivery of the missing middle housing types. The third mistake that we see that we want municipalities to avoid is that limiting the number of units per lot versus regulating a desired form. And this is an issue with our density-based planning and zoning system generally, but when you limit a number of units per lot, you're disincentivizing the delivery of smaller units, which is really what most cities need mostly in terms of delivering attainability and affordability. So back to that cottage court example, that one solution that we've integrated is that instead of treating all units regardless of size the same, so if you have a density-based system, which is dwelling units per acre, you can say, well, if a unit's below 1,000 square feet or it's below 750 square feet, it actually counts as half a unit in that calculation. That's one way to get around this. We actually push for getting away from density and completely within the zoning, just taking that form-based approach and allowing and incentivizing these smaller units. And so the tip is really, instead of saying we're going to allow a certain number of units on a lot, rather saying we're going to clearly define the maximum building envelope and the form and scale of the building very specifically. So you see that in the yellow, but we're going to allow an unlimited number of units within that same building form. So this set of diagrams just shows, this was created for the book as well, that you can fit up to 8 units pretty easily, 8 studio units in the same envelope as a large single family home on that lot. And so we just want to incentivize and enable developers, if they feel there's a market and need for it, to do that sort of thing. And so specifically defining that envelope in our zoning and letting the number of units be more open as you apply it. And the fourth mistake, it's also a form-related mistake, is just not being not effectively regulating the form and scale to ensure that house scale. And a really strong message that comes through in my book that I also now reinforce in my presentation is that we all get caught up in regulating building height, but we really are strong proponents that the building width and depth are just as important as height. And so we encourage cities to regulate and counties to regulate that directly in their efforts to enable missing middle housing or regulate the maximum building footprint. And so why, the question always comes up, why would we regulate maximum building depth versus just allowing the setbacks to sort of define that? The number one reason is that if all of your lots in a neighborhood are the exact same size, that could ensure a predictable outcome. But in most neighborhoods, there's somewhat of a, there are exceptions to lot sizes. There are some developers who have aggregated lots. And so this example, this set of illustrations just so that, on the left, if you regulate by setting a rear setback, if that lot gets deeper, you're getting a much larger building that might be incompatible with the one to the right of it, which has the same rear setback, as opposed to the image on the right that shows if you regulate by a maximum building depth, which is shown in that yellow line, that even if the lots get bigger, it's delivering a predictable form. And so that's a really a notion that and an idea that we promote very heavily. And so why regulate maximum building width versus letting the side setbacks sort of regulate that? So once again, as the lots get wider, or if a developer is able to actually aggregate lots, it means that they can actually deliver a much larger building that is not that house scale that we keep referring back to. And so just highly encourage the direct regulation of maximum building height, width, and depth. So the point where a lot gets to a certain width, it allows multiple buildings as opposed to allowing one large, very wide building that's beyond the intent. Now there's exceptions to this. This is a great multiplex that I photographed in Midtown of Sacramento, and just a really great type on a corner lot that it does fit well into its context. It has that 2-story, a little bit bigger than we might typically define as house scale, but it was a really great exception that needs to be thought about as we're writing our zoning codes. Also, it sort of raised the question, our code writing processes is whether a third floor should be allowed. Just need to be very thoughtful about the impact of allowing that third floor, but understanding the reality is that as you're running pro forma analysis to test the feasibility of the missing middle types as you go through planning and zoning, you may need to enable that third story to really make it feasible, especially in the higher value markets like here in the Bay Area, to enable feasibility of the missing middle types so that they'll actually be delivered. But just understanding that enabling that third story does have impacts, sort of a broader impact on how that building is perceived along the street. So just wanting to be thoughtful about it. And so what we've done to acknowledge this need for the 3 and the 4 story is to say, okay, there's still a need for those slightly bigger types, but we're going to classify them as upper missing middle so that they're a different classification. And we have a zoning district that enables the core missing middle types at the house scale. And it's likely that you would have another zoning district or maybe multiple districts that allow that upper missing middle, so you don't sort of mix the discussion about where the types are going to be enabled. So the last mistake, and it's probably the one that's hardest to tackle, is not effectively addressing parking requirements as a major barrier for missing middle housing. And right, I often ask the question is like, would you rather have an affordable housing problem or a potential parking problem or a perceived parking problem? And I like to start the parking conversation out with this mural, this really creative mural from Banksy that's in Los Angeles that just sort of encourages community members to, bring an open mind and let's get creative about tackling sort of this housing issue by thinking creatively about parking. And, a couple other messages that we've done a better job of providing spaces for cars and people. And I often say that, from a decision maker or a policy standpoint, a city or a county cannot be for affordable housing, but also still be requiring high off-street parking requirements. And so it's just not possible this day and age to have both. And so you need to pick. So the two primary issues with sort of the limitations that parking delivers for the delivery of missing middle are physical constraints that especially on those small to medium-sized infill lots that you can't physically fit missing middle types and a lot of parking. And then secondarily, it really impacts the feasibility that, right, providing more parking leaves less space for development square footage. It often adds additional costs. So it really often makes these projects infeasible from a financial feasibility standpoint. And now we've documented each of these types on a broad range of lot sizes, studying, zero parking requirements, 1 space per unit, 2 space per units, and really have a good understanding that, in most places, if you're requiring more than 1 space per unit, you're not going to get missing middle. And in some places, the higher value markets, you might need to drop that to 0 or even 0.5. And I'm just as be transparent about this, I'm a huge advocate for eliminating parking completely and letting the market decide that in communities. And so this was a great study that Fregonese and Associates did for us in our Austin project that showed the direct impact of parking requirements on both rental and for sale housing. You can see on the right that, in terms of the for sale product, it went at the income required to purchase went with 1 space per unit, $36,000 up to 2 space. When you provide 2 spaces, up to $51,000. So you can see there's a tremendous impact on affordability and attainability that parking does imply. So just need to be thoughtful about it. Wanted to just show a couple of quick examples before I wrap up here in terms of projects that aren't in, a typical compact, walkable urban environment with a lot of transit, but are successfully delivering missing middle with low parking requirements. And this is the missing middle neighborhood called Prairie Queen, or Bungalows on the Lake, that we master planned and developed the missing middle types for a developer called Urban Waters in the Omaha Metro. There's actually there's 152 units built that's represented in this picture. There's actually another 150 in various stages of construction and entitlement. It's been very successful, but the way we tackled parking here was we provided 1 off-street parking space per unit, and then 1 plus parking spaces per unit by providing on-street parking. And it hasn't impacted the feasibility or the viability of this project. Residents actually like that they can park on the street in front of their unit and walk up to the front door. And part of my point about showing this is that if it's feasible to do this with 1 parking space per unit in this fairly suburban context, that it's really viable to think about this in a broad range of contexts in terms of lower parking requirements. Another just really innovative project we're working on will be the largest car-free missing middle community in the country, which is called Cul-de-sac Tempe. It started construction 2 months ago, the horizontal construction, and there's actually a interested list of over 3,000 people signed up that want to live in this. And 150 renters have put deposits on the 130 first units, and people are moving from across the country to move into this car-free environment that's not in downtown. It is along a light rail station, but it's relying on the delivery of mobility choices through car share, bike and scooter share, and to deliver mobility choices. So I just wanted to show this to just make the point that there's innovation happening within mobility and how technology delivers mobility that enables every community to be thinking about the reduction of parking requirements. The other cool aspect of that project is it's able to deliver 60% public space, because we're not providing space for cars, but we're rather providing spaces for the residents. And I just want to I like to use my neighborhood as an example. 90% of the homes in my neighborhood park on the street. It hasn't impacted the value of our neighborhood. It's just the reality, and about 20% of the lots on my block are missing middle scale housing. And so there's lots of great examples that we can learn from. So in terms of concluding thoughts here, before we jump into the Q&A, Chris Nelson did a really great research effort for my book, where he wrote a chapter that you see down there in the yellow that's called Demographic Changes and Growing Preference for Missing Middle Housing. And one of the findings in this is that 62% of the homes built between now and 2040 would need to be missing middle housing to meet the demand. And the sad reality is we're not going to shift that quickly and suddenly be delivering that much missing middle, but that just reinforces how large the demand is and how important it is for us to be responding this. A couple of other interesting statistics that came out of that is 80% of growth between 2018 and 2014 will be in households without children. So once again, smaller units start to make a lot more sense. And that all new housing built between 2017 and 2040 would need to be in walkable locations to meet the demand for walkable living. And so there's that growing demand and the growing need for missing middle. I just want to encourage you, if you're, one of the first steps we encourage our municipal clients to take, whether it's a mayor or a city manager or the planning director trying to assess this, is to do this, complete this missing middle scan, which identifies where a city should prioritize missing middle application and identifies the specific barriers. It's a really great first step that can inform a comprehensive plan. In Greenville, it was plugged directly into the comprehensive plan effort that was in progress. So we did it for Greenville County and the city of Greenville in South Carolina. We're doing it for Greensboro, North Carolina, done it in Idaho Falls, and we're doing a similar effort right now on the West Coast in San Jose as part of their opportunity housing with Economist Strategic Economics and in Santa Rosa. And I just encourage you to don't be afraid to reach out about doing this, completing this as a first step. We think it's a great first step that educates and builds a great foundation for the missing middle conversation. Now whether, there's usually a broad range of backgrounds and specialties of people on here, whether you might be a planner, a decision maker, a realtor, a developer. I think we all need to step up and play a role in addressing this housing crisis that we're in. And one tool in our toolbox needs to be enabling the delivery of missing middle housing. Now, when I was going through architecture school, and if you had told me that I'd be writing housing policy and rewriting zoning codes as part of my practice, I probably would have thought you were crazy. But early on in my practice, I realized that I could have a real impact by bridging the public and private sector, enabling these types. So I just encourage everybody on the webinar here today to step up and play a part in the much needed delivery of these missing middle housing types. And with that, I just want to thank you for coming today. I encourage you to go to Island Press to buy my book. People are really enjoying it. It's a very graphic and approachable book. And follow me on social media, and don't hesitate to reach out and have a discussion about missing middle housing. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Dan. And thanks to everybody who has submitted questions. We've gotten many, as we usually do. And actually, I'm going to start, Dan, if you can turn on your webcam here so we can see you during the Q&A. Actually, Chris Nelson is in the audience today, and he submitted a couple questions, so I thought we could start with him. And he says, hi, Dan. Thanks for these nuances to assuring good missing middle housing design. I have two questions. First, what is your experience with missing middle housing demand during the pandemic in light of cheap mortgage money that artificially induces suburban development? And related to this, second, to what extent is the artificial demand for suburban homes driven by the inability of communities and local builders to expand the supply of missing middle housing?
Yeah, I think that to the second question is, it's definitely, most cities have this problem where it's easier to deliver suburban development, single family homes and other suburban development than it is to deliver missing middle housing or walkable urbanism or other more creative and thoughtful approaches. So we do need to level the playing field so that it's as easy, if ideally not easier, ideally it would be easier to deliver missing middle in the walkable urban context. So as a starting point, a city needs to definitely make it as easy, because if it's easier to do the suburban single family home and the suburban development, it's going to continue to be what developers are defaulting to, because they're trying to limit their risk, reduce their costs, and just they're struggling to deliver housing, period, these days. So to the first part of that question, in terms of the demand, I mean, we're definitely seeing high demand everywhere, ranging from, downtown adjacent neighborhoods in bigger cities to really small towns with, 3,000, 5,000 people. And, I think there is a lot of learning that needs to happen to enable this to happen more broadly and to address some of those barriers I identified. But part of that's where to get financing and how easy it or not it is to get financing. And we're actually seeing a lot of private equity coming into play, especially related to delivering attainability. That's enabled a lot of really high quality and innovative missing middle projects, including ours. And but yeah, the demand is enormous. And I do feel really strongly that one of the reasons the single family detached rental market is exploding is because, number one, the renters don't have a choice. And if you give them the choice of single family detached rental versus maybe missing middle neighborhood rental with a walkable environment, I think a lot of those renters would choose to live in that missing middle neighborhood from a rental perspective. So great questions, Chris. Thanks for joining, and I look forward to these other questions.
Great, thanks, Dan, and we'll just dive right in here. So this is from earlier on in the presentation from Brian S., who's saying, I think two of the biggest perceived concerns for missing middle housing types are noise between units and a lack of privacy. What design features have you developed to avoid those concerns?
Yeah, I mean, as an architect or any architect out there that's, they can use, the detailing of those multi-unit buildings and the stacking of units to mitigate both the horizontal sort of sound, as well as if they're attached, the vertical and horizontal sound attenuation. So, what I would say is there's, we design projects all across the country and often collaborate with local architects of record, and it's usually the solutions are specific to some of the best practices and the techniques that are common in each individual region. But number one, I'll say it is something that needs to be thought about. It hasn't been an issue for a project that we've designed, just as long as we've been thoughtful about it. I will say in our Prairie Queen project, our client has been telling us recently is that there is an expectation on the part of the renters in that neighborhood. They do expect slightly more, slightly less noise between the units, just based on sort of them buying into sort of this innovative and thoughtful project. So we need to think about it. I think most architects can successfully address that, but it has not been an issue in projects we've designed or our colleagues have designed in recent past.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Next question is, I guess, more of a comment, but that you can respond to, from Leslie Moorman, who says, Raleigh, North Carolina has recently passed a missing middle housing policy, which does allow for cottage type housing on single family lots. But I've seen this turn into a loss of a lot of tree canopy when a single family home lot has been purchased, the house torn down and multiple cottages built. Loss of tree canopy is a big concern. Is there anything that they can do about that part?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of neighborhoods that we've worked in that the tree canopy does really play an important part of defining the character, providing shade, passive cooling. So I think, once of all, it's just taking a thoughtful approach. I think in terms of tree preservation, I just encourage cities not to take a a one-size-fits-all approach to every type of context, but rather calibrate their tree preservation based on sort of from the most urban to the least urban context and dial it up and down. But I would say create an incentive. The best thing to do is create an incentive for preserving the trees so that maybe a developer gets an extra unit if they preserve a tree, or an extra couple of units, or they get a 10% decrease in the required parking. Would be the best way to do that. We designed a cottage court called River House. If you just Google River House in Healdsburg, California, that is nearly complete. And I just encourage you to take a look at it, partly because it very thoughtfully worked around a series of existing trees. Some of them were big redwood trees and others were smaller fruit trees. And it, from a design and a placemaking standpoint, it really made that cottage court feel like it had been there for 50, 60 years by preserving those trees. So it's a really good example that you can very thoughtfully work around existing trees to a certain extent. With a cottage court in particular type, it's pretty easy to be thoughtful in that way.
Okay, thanks, Dan. The next question here is from John Arnagost, who's saying, our state building code treats any building with more than 2 units as commercial. Any thoughts on managing heightened building code standards as new types are allowed by zoning, That
is a great point. That is a barrier. That's one of the major barriers for missing middle, is the cost increase when you jump from the residential building code up to the commercial or IBC code. And some good news on that front is the city of Memphis, after we completed their comprehensive plan that had a large missing middle component to it, the city's actually working to make a local adaptation of their residential building code so that it allows up to a certain, maybe 4 or 5 units within it before it jumps up to the IBC or the commercial code to more easily deliver attainability in those lower unit missing middle types. So I will keep, if you sign up for the newsletter at missingmiddlehousing.com, I'll be, or on my LinkedIn, Daniel Parolek LinkedIn account, I'll occasionally be posting something about that progress, because I think will be really precedent setting. And if other cities or counties want to step in and participate in that, John Zana, who's the planning director, said like he's totally open to sort of partnering with other jurisdictions that want to do something similar. So if there's a joint effort to tackle that, it's a really important barrier to address.
Great, thanks, Dan. We got a lot of questions regarding the zoning aspects of this, and a lot of them about whether this can be achieved without having a form-based code.
Well, first of all, in my mind, a form-based code is about a process more it is about a final product. And as like the way that I walked you through the form and scale considerations of the missing middle types and what to look out for and what to try to prevent, if you take those recommendations and implement them into any zoning code, I would suggest that those have form-based DNA within them. I think there's too much. I think we've gotten caught up in form-based coding needing to look a certain way, or if we add graphics, it's suddenly a form-based code. More importantly is that content and that thoughtfulness about what you want to deliver and what you don't want to deliver. So yeah, I mean, we've done efforts where we've just gone in and done targeted fixes to the metrics in an otherwise conventional zoning district. And I would say that's inserting form-based DNA into an otherwise conventional code. And other codes were inserting 1 or 2 new zoning districts that are more form-based than the others would be. But so I'd say don't get caught up in what you call it. I'm a huge proponent of form-based coding, but if that comes with baggage. But the other thing is a more thoughtful form-based approach doesn't need to be more complicated. That's the other sort of misperception. It doesn't need to be more complicated, it just needs to be thoughtful. I hope that answered your question, but I mean, you don't need to call it form-based codes, but a form-based process and methodology is what it's going to take to successfully deliver good results.
Okay, thanks, Dan. I think we'll get into other aspects of zoning here. In fact, here's one from Peyton Chung who's saying, maybe the regulatory problem is that missing middle housing isn't going far enough? Question. It seems like the 2 large houses shown resulted from A, land prices that demand large buildings, and B, zoning that still restricts the number of units that the bulk can be divided into.
Yes. Yeah, hi Peyton, thanks for the question. Yeah, absolutely. I think that, you know, some people have the misperception that I feel that missing middle housing is the only solution, and everything needs to be missing middle scale. I mean, there's absolutely the need and the demand for bigger buildings and more urban context that I think is an important part of a city's toolbox and approach. So I think that's why I inserted that sort of piece about the upper missing middle, partly is that, yes, we need to focus on enabling missing middle. Secondarily, yes, you also need to be thinking about sort of bigger buildings and where those should go and what role they play. And to your second point of, is zoning too restrictive in terms of number of units being allowed? Absolutely. That's to one of my points and mistakes that I see making, is we need to strip away that limitation and let the market decide if it wants 8 units within that building form, or 2 or 3. I think that's a really important part of zoning, and it's not an easy thing to do, but it's a necessity for sure.
Thanks, Dan. Next one here is from Ethan Stuckmeyer, who says, would your opinions on allowing detached middle housing types, 3 or 4 units on a lot in any configuration, would they change if the property could be divided into individual lots to allow for fee simple ownership of both the unit and the land, and thereby creating more home ownership opportunities?
No, I don't think so, because that is actually happening in some places where we see those results, and the built form is still, number one, the built form is not great, and secondarily, they're not achieving attainable price points. I mean, in a way that the broader missing middle can. Where I would be okay allowing multiple detached units on a lot is if there's additional regulations that limit they set at a maximum size of those units, like in a lot of the cottage court standards that we regulate, so that it is delivering more smaller and more highly attainable housing types. That's really the only way that I would sort of promote or propose a bunch of single family detached houses full size on a lot. And sorry, I will also say, I mean, we're doing this right now in several projects where we're running the pro formas, and the pro formas of those, they perform really well. And that's why, right, as developers or builders, that's the first thing they'll default to. But you also have to assess it toward the objectives of delivering attainability, because if you're running those numbers too, you're going to very clearly see that they're not going to deliver attainability. So you got to find the sweet spot in the middle. You might not be able to drop down to a duplex or even a fourplex, but where's the sweet spot where in missing middle housing types, it might be a 6plex or an 8plex where you can deliver high quality living and attainability, and a project that's clearly feasible in a pro forma, so that it will encourage developers to build it.
Okay, thanks, Dan. And thanks also to the folks from the City of Houston Planning Department who've submitted several questions today already, and including this one, which is, what is your recommendation for cities like Houston without zoning?
Yeah, I think it's a conundrum. I wish I had been able to come to Houston for the APA. It was scheduled right when COVID hit us and didn't enable that to happen, because I was looking forward to exploring a lot of those downtown adjacent neighborhoods that seem to have gotten a lot of this slot home infill, some better than others. But I don't know that I have an answer directly, but is there, I guess, is there some carrot or some incentive that can encourage the delivery of other missing middle housing types? I don't know the answer to that. I can't say that I've researched Houston's context all that much, and it is an anomaly, but it's a bit of a conundrum. I'd be happy to talk with you about it and brainstorm a little bit about it, because I'd be kind of curious what a strategy might be. So sorry I don't have a great answer, but I think then my initial thought is there a way to create an incentive for the right solution or right built outcome? But I don't know exactly what that would be right now.
Thanks, Dan. And your contact information is on the screen for anybody who wants to send you an email if you haven't already written that down. Next question here is from Billy Cooney, who says, in my experience, planners tend to rezone based on what neighbors will accept and then hope the market will provide more housing in the new zoning code. What processes or tools can planners use to make sure the new zoning will appeal to developers and the homes will actually get built?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I've number 6 on my mistakes list is not running pro forma analysis while you're writing new missing middle zoning, because I do every effort we're doing right now with targeted zoning fixes for missing middle has an economist on board, where we're studying what I just walked through in response to Ethan's question of, understanding what's economically viable, but also understanding what delivers attainability, and actually, finding a form somewhere in the middle that's also acceptable to community members, and how to effectively communicate that. It's not an easy thing, but I think the momentum has shifted just because of the dire affordability crisis that we're in, that there's more and more support politically for this, and more community members realizing, hey, my kid just graduated from college but can't actually afford to move back into the town that they grew up in. We do need some of these choices, and also groups like ARP promoting it to their broader constituency. So not an easy solution, but I would say number 1 needs to be including pro forma analysis in that study, and then just educating community members. I talk about that quite a bit in my book, and that's really the primary reason I created this concept of missing middle, is to enable the framing of a housing conversation that can be effective. Because if we walk into a room and say, hey, we need to increase the density, or hey, we're going to bring multifamily to your neighborhood, we're not going to build support for those efforts if that's the way we frame them. So it's important to frame it and communicate effectively through missing middle as well.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Next question here is from David Rabinowitz, who's asking, how much of what you're discussing is a question of aesthetics rather than functionality? Didn't aesthetics drive the old standards?
I don't think this is at all about aesthetics. I think that's really important to differentiate aesthetics from form and scale, because form and scale is regulated by every zoning code, versus aesthetics, which is what I consider architecture, that often is regulated or implemented through design guidelines, which I have mixed feelings about, and often I often discourage guidelines except in really specific conditions. But so I think it's absolutely not about aesthetics, but it is about form and scale, and I think we need to differentiate that and be clear about that. Now, some communities are deciding that in addition to the form and scale, they want some additional aesthetic requirements to make sure there's a certain quality. The only way that I encourage that or support that is if just making sure that that's not adding another layer of review and uncertainty to the review process, because these smaller missing middle projects need to have a really clear path from start to finish an entitlement, otherwise they won't happen. And so very important to differentiate aesthetics from form and scale in this conversation for sure.
Okay, we actually got several comments about the attainability that you were talking about. And here's a question from Chris Larson who asks, can the market really provide attainability purely by design and use regulations, absent any direct government subsidies? I've seen 900 square foot cottage housing go for the same price as a 1,200 square foot single family residential unit.
Yeah, great point. And I mean, once again, it comes back to that's why you need to run that pro forma analysis as you're going through that process, because we have, through our architecture process and our work with developers, been able to deliver affordability by design, and it's usually capped out at, it varies based on what market and what region you're in, at about 60% of the median income and up. And in higher value markets, it's probably higher, or it might even be 100% of market average median income and above. So you need to make sure that your zoning standards are delivering a built result, because if it delivers a duplex, the units in that duplex may not be attainable, but if it delivers a fourplex or a sixplex on that same lot, it may actually be attainable. So attainability by design is important, and so it needs to be assessed while a city is working through that process. Now, that being said, there's also a role for what we call capital A affordable, which is housing that needs to be subsidized for all those households that are below that 50 to 60% median income or below, generally speaking. And a chapter in my book is about affordability and missing middle, and there are a couple of good case studies about how missing middle was applied to projects where subsidies, whether they're federal subsidies or local subsidies, were used to achieve a higher level of affordability. So you can have both, but I think both are important in terms of being part of a city's or municipality's toolbox.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Here's another question from our Houston colleagues who are saying the core issue is that the market wants to sell as much square feet as possible. How do we incentivize smaller units?
Well, there's a sweet spot which most of our projects with developers hit, where developers are getting a higher per square foot price for smaller units. So part of it's encouraging and kind of demonstrating kind of where that sweet spot is with a smaller unit, where they can actually get more per square foot for those smaller units. But that means, right, they need to be able to deliver more units on that same lot, which in Houston, it sounds like they can probably do, but in most places they can't, because it's capped, whether based on a density or some other regulatory requirement. So an interesting conundrum there, but so there is a sweet spot where that higher value per square foot, if a developer can start thinking that way, can become attractive to the developers in a more thoughtful project that also tends to not have as much competition in a market than a larger, more conventional project or product type.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Got several questions about parking. In fact, even before you brought it up as a topic here, not surprisingly. So I'll ask a couple now. Here's one from Stacy Snell, who's asking, how are communities handling no parking or less parking where transit and other public transportation does not exist? We are still auto dependent.
Yeah, I think I typically divide this answer into responses, appropriate responses based on two different types of contexts, because in the older parts of a community that are usually the gridded streets are built prior to the 1940s, even if there's not transit available, it's usually a very bikeable and a walkable place in terms of comfort and being comfortable walking. And so those are really low-hanging fruit, even if there's not transit, for even the wholesale removal of parking requirements, because part of it, you need to make sure that you're allowing on-street parking as part of that solution, which every good walkable neighborhood has. And then in more suburban environments, it is a little bit harder, because even in our projects that for developers that are a little bit more suburban context, we tend to provide a little bit more parking. But just getting creative about that, like the Prairie Queen neighborhood that is successful with 1 parking space per unit, and the rest of the parking being dealt with on street is just a great model that I wanted to show because it is suburban, but it's functioning with 1 off-street space per unit, no guest parking, and so I feel that's a very viable approach for any context. And with more mobility choices being accessible at our fingertips through car share and Uber and Lyft, and bike share, and even just more and more, especially the millennials wanting to live a car light lifestyle, I just encourage cities to let's strip away those barriers. Let's let the market decide. And I think this fear of it causing an apocalypse is really unwarranted and has not happened anywhere where parking's been reduced. So just encourage not to fear it and just know it's a necessity to deliver housing choice and let it happen. And put a clause in when you do the reduction saying we're going to assess this again in 2 years or 3 years, and just make sure it's not causing major issues.
Thanks, Dan. Another question about parking is from Ellen Sands, who says, to me, the parking issue is not just impermeable surfaces on lots, but also the adverse impact on streets. In older, denser neighborhoods, they can create traffic and safety issues where you want to encourage pedestrians and kids, etc. I guess it's more of a comment, but maybe you want to respond to it.
Yeah, it's I understand. I think parking. Well, anyway, I didn't quite understand pieces of that, but traffic is always one of the concerns that come up. And what I say is, if you provide a project that accommodates 2+ spaces per unit, it's absolutely going to generate a lot of traffic. If you accommodate a project that's 0.5 spaces per unit, it's likely to attract either renters or buyers that are wanting to live either a car light or car, maybe a household with 1 car versus 2, or maybe somebody that rides their bike or walks a little bit more. So it's actually going to generate less traffic. So yeah, there's a lot of different aspects of parking, but my message is that it's an aspect that has to be addressed, or missing middle will not be delivered. And we just need to get more and more comfortable with lower parking requirements or eliminating parking requirements, and let's see what happens, because I think the market's going to respond really well. I think there's people that are happy to park their car on the street in many contexts, or in many people looking to live a more car-light lifestyle that we can reduce the cost of those units by not delivering parking for.
Got it. Okay. We'll kind of move on to other topics here. Here's a question from Mark McCaskill, who's asking, are there any financial institution or financial system barriers to missing middle housing at the loan origination, secondary market, private equity, or other level?
What we see a little bit of, and it's changing pretty in a good way, that in smaller towns where builders and developers rely on their local banks for funding, a lot of times because there wasn't a comp in the market, there wasn't a similar project recently built in the market, so the banks saw it as a really risky loan to give. But we find that more and more of those, even the smaller institutions, the banks are understanding that there's a need for this and stepping up and educating themselves, and they're being smart about it, but they're giving loans to these missing middle scale projects. Where we see the biggest barrier is with condos, and two things. It's developers having to get a certain percentage to pre-sell a certain percentage of the units before they can actually get financing, and then the buyers, it's harder to get a mortgage for a condo building than it is for a single family detached house, and From what I understand, there are some changes being made on that front that are really necessary, because the reality is as fewer and fewer households can afford to buy a single family home or don't want to buy a single family home, the sort of ownership in terms of condos in these different missing middle formats is we really need to figure out the way to strip away these added complexities and these barriers to enable that to happen more easily. So it's a great question. We could dive and we could do a whole session on the financial aspects of and barriers of missing middle related to financing, but those are just a couple. I talk a little bit more about it in the book, but even picking up the Attainable Housing publication by ULI has some good information in it and some good resources.
Okay, thanks, Dan. We'll go maybe 5 or 6 more minutes before we wrap up. So thanks to everybody for submitting questions. We're still getting a lot of them in, and they're really great. We'll share them all with Dan so he can see them, even the ones that we don't get to during the program. Next question here is, in terms of mistake number 1, row housing, how would you tackle row housing on corner lots where the building has to have more depth to face the flanking street?
Yeah, that's a good question. A nicely nuanced thought. Yeah, on the historic patterns is for the corner lots for a townhouse, which is a very viable and a good solution, is to oftentimes it does go from the front to rear setback, but it has frontage facing onto that side street. So I think that's a good application on a corner lot. It has that frontage engaging both streets, and especially if it sticks at 2 stories when it's abutting those adjacent units. But if you go to missingmiddlehousing.com to the townhouse type, I know there's a number of townhouse examples. I know I'm just envisioning a couple of them from Detroit actually that are just really great corner townhouse examples. So yeah, there's nuances to this and there's exceptions. But once again, the fact that you're just thinking about this is like, that's a good first start of like, hey, is this the corner conditions a little bit differently? How do we apply the types? And that's why when we're writing standards in a zoning district, that we have different standards for a mid-block lot versus a corner lot, because of those nuances and the different potential results or desired results on a corner lot. So good question and good thought.
Thanks, Dan. Next question and comment here is from Byron Falwell, who says, Dan, thank you so much for this talk and for mentioning my hometown of Boise, Idaho, where I practice architecture and am involved in rewriting our zoning code. I've noticed that opponents of form-based codes are critical of this approach because it is perceived to dampen innovation in housing types and housing forms. Do you feel that our best and most useful housing types and forms are found in historical examples and not in the as yet undiscovered types?
I mean, I think it's both. I think we need to learn from the types that existed. But there's obviously innovation that can happen within the missing middle realm. And to address that, a lot of times in our zoning codes, we'll often say, hey, here's the 5, 6, 7 missing middle types that are allowed in this area. If you want to introduce another type, here's the process for doing that. You have to go through one additional step to just make sure it meets the step of review to make sure that it meets the intent of the code. But I know I don't have confidence in the development community, or I can say this as an architect and architects, in just leaving it completely wide open, because you'll get some bad results, you'll get some excellent results. But so I think the best thing to do is being really clear about parameters that, to date might be based on learning from the old versions, but leaving that flexibility with some supplemental review for additional interpretations. Now, that being said, is what we are seeing and exploring even in our practice is, like, you may have a 4-plex or a 6-plex form, but instead of each one of those units having their own living space and kitchen, there's a lot of this push toward co-living where a certain number of those units or all those units actually share that communal space. And that's another way that we see attainability being delivered. And it's really attractive in particular to younger households. And so, yeah, there's some innovation that absolutely needs to happen. We don't want to stifle the innovation, but we ultimately just want to deliver predictability in terms of what the outcome is to in the zoning that we're writing and rewriting.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Wes, here, a couple more here and we'll wrap. Here's a question and comment from Catherine Bryers, who said, can you say more about striking the right balance with form-based standards between helpful regulation and excessive complexity? You spoke to this at the end of your second mistake, but I was hoping you could say more on what specifically to avoid in form-based codes.
I think the first mistake that I see is the metrics aren't calibrated to your local context. So every city has a certain set of lot sizes that are typical. It might have LA loaded conditions, it might have non-LA loaded conditions, it might have sort of different block configurations that happen. And a lot of times what we see, and this was the mistake of Euclidean zoning, is one city said 35-foot height and this setback and this minimum lot size, and then 1,000 cities copied it. But a real form-based process analyzes those existing conditions, everything from lot sizes and setbacks and building types, and uses that analysis to inform what those metrics in terms of the form are. And I will say it's really disappointing to see how many efforts that are called form-based codes don't actually do that. So the metrics are wrong. The other thing is, like, in this, we're part of the reason this happened is graphics became too much of the focus of form-based coding, where 90% of the effort is adding graphics versus 90% of the effort should have been calibrating the code and creating the right set of zoning districts. And other mistakes we see is still using density. We often see a category called multifamily as a use, and they're saying that's going to enable missing middle housing. And the reality is multifamily is not a type, it's a use. And like, we need to break that down. And that's one of the primary goals of missing middle. So those are just a handful of mistakes we see. Unfortunately, they happen pretty commonly. I wrote a 2-part series for zoning practice, 7 or 8 years ago, that I encourage you to look up. That's common mistakes in form-based coding to avoid, and unfortunately the same mistakes are being made today. Those are some of the examples. Like I said earlier, if you don't want to call it form-based coding because it's going to create additional unwanted attention, or sort of this fear of doing something that might sort of just automatically increase the scale of buildings everywhere, just call it the most thoughtful, effective way to deliver predictability. You don't have to call it a certain thing.
Okay. Just one last question before we wrap, and I'll ask for final thoughts after this. Dan, have you given any thought to applying missing middle principles to commercial development? It seems like we're moving toward a built environment of only big box retail, strip malls, or token commercial space in a mixed use building.
Yeah, I think it's just, I think it's absolutely something that needs to be thought about. I think, a lot of my colleagues at the Congress for New Urbanism have been thinking about this and been sort of really focusing on the Chuck Marone at Strongstown is a really amazing resource for this, as well as a more incremental and smaller scale approach to not just allowing development, but economic development. I often encourage the cities that spending money on rewriting their zoning code should be seen as an economic development strategy as opposed to just another planning process, because a lot of cities can't find the funding to spend on zoning, but it is really economic development. And the more of that small development that we can encourage, the more sustainable the local economies are, the more locally that money stays. And, Joe Minicozy does a lot of great analysis as well as, the tax benefits of that smaller development. And I just encourage you to, Joe Minicozy and Urban 3, look up his work as well. It's absolutely part of the conversation. Missing middle is just one piece of that, and the broader discussion about incremental and smaller scale, especially in smaller towns or transitions from larger downtowns, is a really important conversation that every municipality should definitely be having for sure. And to the previous question about the zoning, a good portion of the book focuses on zoning specific mistakes and recommendations of how to fix them. And some of the content I wrote related to zoning got pulled out due to the length of the book, but I just encourage you to pick it up and take a look at it. Buy it for your council members, buy it for your city, your planning commissioners, your design review committee members, your mayor, and get them excited about it. Because we see that, where there's the most success is where there's the political will, the understanding that how effective missing middle can be as one of the tools in a larger housing toolbox in a municipality.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Actually, we did get a lot of questions, which we usually do, about how you can engage with elected officials to build the support for these things. So, and I know we covered this topic with you last year as well. So those of you who have looked at our webinar archives page, you can watch our initial missing middle session with Dan from last July. Anyway, we never have enough time for all the questions, and I appreciate everybody who submitted some, but just wondered, Dan, if you have any kind of closing thoughts and takeaways for this session today.
Yeah, I think part of it's building upon the last discussion and point is like, how do you build support? Part of my point is don't be afraid to start small, like start with a missing middle presentation with whether you get a group together of your decision makers to attend the Smart Growth webinar or have me come and give a presentation in person, which seems foreign, but is nice to have that option now. And don't be afraid with that small step of just starting by planting the seeds of the conversation about what is missing middle, why is it important. But also don't be afraid to take a big step at the beginning. And if there's momentum in your community, like grab that momentum and take advantages of it. Here in my home city of Berkeley, California, the city council built some really great momentum. And like, gosh, it's probably been about 6 months ago. Eliminated parking requirements citywide, and then another 3 or 4 weeks later, voted unanimously to allow 3 to 4 lots on any lot in the city. And so there was good momentum. So they're like, well, let's jump on this wave and keep going. So we do see a lot of cities buying my book as a reference point because it is very approachable for some of those decision makers as another point. And the other thing I cannot underestimate the value of is gathering a catalog of photographs of local or regional missing middle housing types and create a poster for each of the missing middle housing types, because that's a really approachable way to shift the conversation away from those scary terms like density and multifamily and shift it toward missing middle housing choice, form and scale. And people can go up and point to a cottage court that might exist on their street and start talking about how their friend or their one of their kids or at some point in their life they lived in one of those or that specific example of missing middle. It sort of personalizes the conversation. So I think it's good to just start as soon as possible. Don't be afraid to make an incremental step, but also don't be afraid to make that big step if there's some momentum already or then a really dire need to do it that the decision makers can acknowledge and understand.
Thanks, Dan. And this will conclude our webinar today, the top 5 missing middle housing implementation mistakes and how to avoid them. I'd like to offer a great big thank you to Dan Parolek for a great presentation, to everyone who attended today, and to John Coleman, our communications and technology guru who helps to make this all happen. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org, and also for those of you who have requested one, especially AIA members, all attendees will receive an email that will contain a link to a personalized certificate of participation. Please look for this follow-up email. When you exit from today's webinar, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. Finally, keep an eye on smartgrowth.org and your email inbox for details on other future webinars, including part 2 of our Smart Growth at 25 webinar series next Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern. What have we learned about smart growth principles with the National Center for Smart Growth? With that, I wish you all a great day.